And here we go. 4 resurrection accounts, can they be reconciled? Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15, 3b-4. Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. What is the one thing Christianity has that no other faith has? And that is the resurrection from the dead. The one we follow, the one who brought God's message, authenticated himself by the resurrection from the dead. That is what proves that he's telling the truth, proves he is who he said, and it is essential. If he didn't do it, our faith is pointless. How do we know about it? Well, as we've seen earlier, there are 4 separate accounts in the New Testament about Jesus' resurrection. The gospel books written by Matthew, the apostle, Mark, the agent for Peter, Luke, the Gentile companion of Paul, who got his information from eyewitnesses, and John the apostle, the one who was personally closest to Jesus of all. So in this, we have a strong basis for belief, as we have seen in our earlier talk. But some will challenge it on different grounds. They will say, what if these 4 people are actually not telling the same story? What if their accounts are so contradictory that they cannot be fitted together, they cannot be reconciled? In that case, we would have to question their credibility. But is that the case? Are they really contradictory? Well, many scholars will say yes. Yes, they are. One example, the Gospels are so problematic for historians who want to know what really happened. This is especially true for the Gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. They're filled with discrepancies, some of which cannot be reconciled. In fact, the Gospels disagree on nearly every detail in their resurrection narratives. That is Bart Ehrman, the former evangelical who now is trying to tear down faith in God, author of How Jesus Became God and many other such books. Here's another. The sources we have differ on every important detail about the resurrection. The order of events, the events themselves, the people present, and the supernatural events diverge in every account. This from Matthew S. McCormick, author of Atheism and the Case Against Christ. And another, contradictions exist in almost every detail between the 4 gospel accounts of the events surrounding the discovery of the empty tomb. All the other details contradict each other so blatantly that we have no reason whatsoever to believe any of them to be historically true. That from Paul Tobin, forward by Gerd Ludemann. Yet another, the variant nature of the reports of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances in the Gospels speaks against their historicity. The Gospels and other New Testament sources can't even present us with a harmonious witness to the events surrounding the appearances of the risen Jesus. It goes without saying that no weight can be given to accounts which contradict each other in every major detail. There's not a single example of a common resurrection appearance between any 2, let alone 3, of Matthew, Luke, or John's accounts. There's a common factor in the women, but even here the details are different and incompatible. There's also a certain commonality in that the appearances are to followers of Jesus, but beyond that, all the details of the appearances are widely divergent and in many respects thoroughly irreconcilable. It doesn't take an abundance of logical thought to conclude that the overwhelmingly compelling deduction to be made, taken with the fact that Mark contains no resurrection appearances whatsoever, that all the descriptions of such appearances in the canonical Gospels are the invention of the later evangelists. This from Earl Doherty, challenging the verdict, a cross-examination of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. Well, discrepancies, divergences, contradictions, blatant contradictions, contradictions in every detail, contradictions that are incompatible, irreconcilable. Well, those are the claims. Are they true? What are all these contradictions that are supposed to be incompatible? Well, let's look at Dr. Arman again in his book, Jesus Interrupted, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible and why we don't know about them. He has a bunch. Who actually went to the tomb? Mary alone, according to John, Mary and other Mary, Matthew 28, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, Mark 16, or women who had accompanied Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, possibly Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women, Luke 24:1. Had the stone already been rolled away, Mark, or was it rolled away by an angel while they were there, Matthew? Whom or what did they see there? An angel, Matthew, a young man, Mark, two men, Luke, or nothing and no one, John? What were they told? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee where Jesus would meet them, Mark 16, or to remember what Jesus had told them while he was in Galilee, that he had to die and rise again, Luke 24. Do the women tell the disciples what they saw and heard, Matthew, or do they tell anyone? Or do they not tell anyone, Mark 16? If they tell someone, whom do they tell? The 11 disciples, Matthew. The 11 disciples and other people, Luke. Simon Peter and another unnamed disciple, John. What do the disciples do in response? Do they have no response because Jesus immediately appears to them, Matthew 20? Do they not believe the women because it seems to be an idle tale, Luke 24? Or do they go to the tomb to see for themselves, John 20, verse 5? One point in particular seems to be irreconcilable. In Matthew's account, the women are instructed to tell the disciples to go to Galilee to meet Jesus, and they immediately do so. He appears to them there and gives them their final instruction. But in Luke, the disciples are not told to go to Galilee. They are told that Jesus had foretold his resurrection while he was in Galilee, and they never leave Jerusalem. On the day of resurrection, Jesus appears to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Later that day, these disciples tell the others what they have seen, and Jesus appears to all of them. And then Jesus takes them to Bethany on the outskirts of Jerusalem and gives them their instructions and ascends to heaven. The disciples are in fact explicitly told by Jesus after his resurrection not to leave Jerusalem. And so the discrepancy. If Matthew is right that the disciples immediately go to Galilee and see Jesus ascend from there, how can Luke be right that the disciples stay in Jerusalem the whole time, see Jesus ascend from there, and stay on until the day of Pentecost? And how would the disciples know anyway? So they went out and fled from the tomb, the women, and they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So how would anybody know if they said nothing to anyone? But in Matthew, we read, so they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to bring his disciples word. So which of these was it? So it seems as if there are indeed irreconcilable discrepancies. What do we do with these? Well, what about harmonization? Is it possible? Is it possible to put together a coherent narrative in which all of these things that are stated all happen, but in such a way that nothing contradicts anything else? Skeptics will say no. You're just spinning fanciful scenarios. You're coming up with unrealistic situations. And they will say, even if you accept harmonization, it won't work in this case. The discrepancies are, in fact, irreconcilable. And it's not just liberal scholars who are saying this now. We now have evangelicals like Michael Licona. In his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? His answer is, the difference is because the writers forgot things, got some things wrong, and in some cases simply made up stuff and changed stuff to make the story more interesting. So he seems to believe as well that it cannot be reconciled. Well, how do we respond to this? First, I would say you need to start by establishing the principle that there are events that have happened in real life that seem on the surface irreconcilable, seem contradictory, but in fact can easily be harmonized. And sometimes you might say, well, the harmonization seems far-fetched, but it still is true. Consider, for example, the death of Rasputin, the Russian monk who became a confidant of the last Tsar of Russia's wife, and ended up getting killed. Now, we said Rasputin was killed by assassins who poisoned him. Rasputin was killed by assassins who shot him. Okay? On the surface, that sounds contradictory. How did he die? Was he poisoned or was he shot? And on the surface, it sounds contradictory, but in point of fact, they're both true. The people who plotted to kill Rasputin invited him to dinner and put lots of poison into his food and drink, and he ate it. It didn't kill him. As the gloves were off, then they pulled out guns and shot at him as he was running, and they did hit him, but not a fatal wound. And they tracked him until he was on a bridge, and he fell over into the icy river below, never to be seen again. We don't know for sure exactly what killed him, but both of these statements are true. He was killed by assassins who poisoned him. He was killed by assassins who shot him. They did both things. Here's another example from Daniel Boone, the great American hero. And one source tells us Daniel Boone was famous for exploring the western part of the state of Virginia, where he built Boonesboro. Another source tells us Daniel Boone was famous for exploring Kentucky, where he built Boonesboro. Well, we could suggest, well, he explored both. The problem is here, where did he build Boonesboro? Mm-hmm. Was there more than one Boonesboro? Should have said where he built a Boonesboro. No, there really was only one. So how is this not contradictory? Virginia is a different state from Kentucky. This has got to be a contradiction, doesn't it? Well, actually, no, because at the time of Daniel Boone, there was no state of Kentucky. There was a large state of Virginia, and Boone did actually explore the western part of it, build Boonesboro there. Subsequently, that western portion became the state of Kentucky. Okay? So you write it down, you can use either name you want. They're both true, even though on the surface they seem very contradictory. So things that seem to be contradictory may not be. They may still be true. But I'd like to look at a more detailed example now where we actually compare 4 written accounts, like the 4 gospel books. Those little short accounts, and look at how many differences you come up with them and how many seem to be contradictory. And what I have picked here, it comes from the 2015 World Junior Hockey Championships. What happened after the semifinal game between Russia and Sweden was the Russian defenseman Rinat Valyev was interviewed in the dressing room. And you see there in the corner an audio recorder. He was interviewed by a number of reporters from different periodicals. And I pulled 4 written accounts of it. And I understand there was one interview. All of these sources were there. They had modern recording equipment. They wrote up their accounts on the very day of the interview, and they were published the very next day. Okay? There's no historical question about the fact that Rinat Valyev was there and he did an interview with them. Let's look at the write-ups. Okay? Globe and Mail, we know everyone would cheer against us, said 19-year-old forward Ivan Barbashev after Russia's upset victory over Sweden in the semis. It's pretty normal here for Canadians. Probably they hate Russians. Are you scared of Canada? Of course not, said defenseman Rinat Valyev, giggling. Ahead of the second semi, he shrugged off questions about the likely final. It's going to be a tough game against Canada, small pause for effect, or Slovakia. As he said it, he looked over at Mr. Barbashev and smirked. That's the Globe and Mail. The National Post tells us that Rinat Valyev barely could contain his excitement. The Russian defenseman, a Maple Leafs prospect, is going to the gold medal game at the World Junior Hockey Championships. Best experience of my life, said Valyev after Russia dispatched Sweden 4-1 Sunday in the semifinals. I've been waiting for this all my life. I'm pretty excited. Toronto Sun. Rinat Valiev barely could contain his excitement. Ooh, sorry, jumped over National Post. There you go. National Post. The Russians, meanwhile, didn't sound all that worried about their chances in the final. Defenseman Rinat Valiev was asked if he was scared of a matchup against the Canadians in the gold medal game. Of course not, he responded, smiling. It's an excited feeling, you know, he said in somewhat halting English. I've been waiting for this my whole life, so I'm pretty excited. And then the London Free Press. Rinat Valiev, the Leafs' third rounder, who was largely overshadowed in Toronto's William Nylander love fest, smartly busted up a threatening Swedish 2-on-1 late in the second. I was waiting for this all my life, the Kootenay OHL defender said. We're playing fine right now. We play like one team. That's the biggest thing for us, trying to play physical and support each other. The Swedes crumbled when it counted. They have been among the final 4 teams at this event 9 straight years, but have only won it all once in that time. The Russians, who haven't made a ton of friends here, are proving hard to write off. All they know is keep those boos coming. Everybody's going to cheer against us, Barbashev said. But it's pretty normal here for Canadians. They probably hate Russia. Okay. Now, bear in mind that these accounts are very short, much shorter than the resurrection accounts. They were written on the very day the interview was conducted. The writers had access to digital recordings of the interview. And yet, you compare the 4 accounts, you will find there are only 2 facts that are in all 4 accounts. The name Rinat Valiev, and that Valiev is a defenseman. Now, remember, we're told that you look at the gospel accounts, and this one is recorded only by John. Therefore, it can't be true. You'll find Shabriali will be saying, that account of the Roman soldier who put the spear into Jesus' side, well, but it's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It can't be true. And yet here we see of all the facts mentioned in the 4 accounts, there's only 2 of them that are in all 4 accounts. All of them are recording things that are in only 3 sources, only 2 sources, or only 1 source. Yet they're all true. How many players were being interviewed? National Post and Toronto Sun say 1, but the Globe and Mail and the London Free Press say 2. Does Valiev play for Russia, according to the Sun, or for the Kootenay, according to the London Free Press? Did Valiev say it's going to be the top game against Canada or Slovakia, as the Globe and Mail had it? Or did he say it's an excited feeling, you know, National Post? Or did he say best experience of my life, Toronto Sun? Or was it, we're playing fine right now, we play like one team, that's the biggest thing for us, trying to play physical and support each other, London Free Press. How can the 4 accounts be true when what they have Valiev saying is so different in each account? Did Valiev smartly bust up a threatening Swedish 2-on-1 late in the second? Well, yes, says the London Free Press, but no, says the Globe and Mail, National Post, and the Toronto Sun. It's mentioned in only 1 source, it can't be true. So many contradictions in such short reports. Okay? There's actually a lot more of them if you read the full article. So many contradictions in such short reports, but are they really contradictions? There are only 2 facts in all 4 accounts. Okay? Well, so what? Is there a reason every writer has to give every detail, or can he choose which ones he wants to put in? Of course he can choose which ones he wants to put in. There's no reason that all 4 accounts have to mention all of the facts. How many players were being interviewed? National Post and the Toronto Sun say 1, but the Globe and Mail and the London Free Press say 2. But that's not really what happened. The National Post and Toronto Sun only mention 1. They don't mention Barbashev. Globe and Mail and London Free Press do mention Barbashev, but it's the fact that the National Post and Sun don't mention Barbashev. Does that mean they say there was only 1 player there? Are they saying Barbashev was not there? Are they contradicting the other 2? No. National Post writer, Toronto Sun writer just chose to mention Valiev. He didn't want to talk about Barbashev. Not a contradiction. 1 angel at the tomb or 2 angels at the tomb. 1 mentions 2, 1 mentions 1. Ooh, that's a contradiction. No, it's not. Does Valiev play for Russia or for the Kootenay? Seems to be a clear contradiction. External evidence will tell you that the Kootenay is his regular Western Hockey League team, but this is an international tournament where you play for your country, in his case, Russia. Okay? So both are true. Did Valiev say it's going to be a top game against Canada or Slovakia? Did he say it's an exciting feeling, Did he say best experience of my life? Did he say playing fine right now? 4 totally different texts. Okay. But so what? Could he not have said all 4 of them? Well, he did, right? And each writer is only picking part of the total interview material. So to say that this is a contradiction is nonsense, and yet that's what they're going to say about the gospel accounts. What about, did Valiev smartly bust up a threatening Swedish 2-on-1 late in the second? Yes, says London Free Press. No, says the Globe and Mail, National Post. So when anybody says this is a contradiction, they'll all tell you, the London Free Press writer mentioned it. The others didn't mention it. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. And yet you're going to find skeptics will say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't mention the spear, so it didn't really happen. This is exactly what you see in these 4 accounts is exactly the sort of criticisms that are leveled against the resurrection accounts. The claims of contradiction, irreconcilable contradictions, you see the exact same things. And it makes me wonder, people who bring these charges against the gospel books, have they ever tried to look at multiple accounts of current events? Because if they had, how would they not notice that this is the kind of phenomenon you have whenever you have more than one person reporting on the same events? Or do they know that and they would never say this is a contradiction, but when it comes to gospel books, they do? Are they using a double standard and a completely unreasonable double standard? Okay, and hope that people don't notice. Okay, you need to call them on this, folks. You cannot let them get away with it. Can these 4 accounts of the interview be reconciled? Of course. Okay? And in case you're wondering, yes, Canada did win. They beat the Russians 5-4. Maybe Valiev should have been afraid. Okay. So the 4 accounts can be reconciled. What about the resurrection accounts? Well, they'll tell you it can't. Okay. And I wonder here too, did they ever sit down and try? Or did they go there looking for differences and claim these are irreconcilable? Okay. To reconcile means, can you put together a coherent whole, a reasonable coherent whole, that includes every one of the details said so that there's actually no contradiction? Okay. Can you sit there and think of what people are likely to do in real life in this kind of situations they faced? And with that, put together a coherent whole? And the answer is yes. Okay. And I did it. And here it is. And you'll see as I go through these steps and I give you the biblical references to them, you will see that every single detail said in all 4 gospel accounts are all there. They all happened. They're all covered. No contradictions. Let's begin. Early in the morning after the Sabbath, certain women buy more spices, Mark 16:1, and go to the tomb of Jesus. These women comprised the women who had come with him from Galilee, Luke 23:55, the antecedent to the day in Luke 24:1, and certain other women with them. These include, but need not be limited to, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, Mary the mother of James, who may be the other Mary, Salome, and Joanna. The day is just beginning, and it is still dark when they leave, but the sun has risen by the time they reach the tomb. The women wonder who will move the stone away from the tomb opening for them, but when they get there, they discover the stone already moved. It had been rolled away by an angel. The women cannot see the body of Jesus in the tomb. The other women stay outside the tomb as Mary runs to tell the disciples the news. She tells Peter and John. Peter and John run to the tomb. John reaches it first. He does not enter, but sees the empty linen cloths lying there. Peter enters the tomb and looks over the linen cloths, and then John enters the tomb also. Then they return home. Mary has returned with Peter and John when they came to the tomb and rejoined the other women who were still there waiting. The women, perhaps emboldened by Peter and John's foray into the tomb, now enter the tomb themselves. They encounter 2 angels, one of them in the form of a young man. The women are told that Jesus is not in the tomb, but has risen, and are told to tell his disciples that he rose and will go before them into Galilee, where they will see him. They are reminded that Jesus foretold his resurrection. The women flee from the tomb, trembling and amazed, and say nothing to anyone for fear. Mary is still at the tomb, either having fled just outside or returning after getting over her initial shock at the encounter with the angels. The two angels are still there and ask her why she is still weeping, a very reasonable question in light of the fact they had told her Jesus had risen, which should cause joy and not weeping. Mary answers that she is weeping because Jesus' body has been removed and she does not know where it has been laid. Clearly, then, she did not believe the angel's message, nor was she convinced of her resurrection by an empty tomb. Jesus appears to Mary, and she initially thinks he's the gardener, but recognizes him when he calls her by name. Jesus tells her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." This is his first post-resurrection appearance, Mark 16:9. Mary rejoins the other women who are still in the vicinity of the tomb and tells them about her encounter with Jesus. They now head away from the tomb to tell the disciples what had happened. As they are on their way, Jesus meets them and they worship him. He reiterates the command for his disciples to go to Galilee where they will see him. That's Matthew 28:8-10. As the women are on their way, the tomb guards report all the things that had happened to the chief priests. The chief priests, in consultation with the elders, bribed the tomb guards to say that they had fallen asleep and Jesus' disciples had meanwhile stolen the body. We don't know for sure this happened while they were on their way, but it'll be somewhere around there. The women report the news to the disciples, but they do not believe them. Mark 16:10-11, Luke 24:9-11, John 20:18, Luke 24:22-24. Peter runs back to the tomb and sees the linen cloths again, and he departed, marveling to himself at what had happened. Jesus then appears to Peter, though it's not specified exactly when this happened. It may have been when he was on his way back from the second trip to the tomb, but we cannot know with certainty. Jesus appears to two people as they went into the country. Jesus appears to Cleopas and another disciple as they are on their road to Emmaus. These may be two accounts of the same incident or two separate post-resurrection appearances. Jesus spent some time with Cleopas and his companion, opening the scriptures to them and breaking bread with them. Jesus appears to the remaining apostles that evening in Jerusalem and proves himself to be physically risen by the wounds in his body and by eating. The meeting was in Jerusalem, not Galilee, because the unbelieving disciples had ignored the command to go to Galilee, and so Jesus rebukes them for their unbelief. Jesus was seen by the disciples during the subsequent 40 days, during which he presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs and taught them. During this time, he taught them, opened the scripture to them, prepared them for their ministry, and promised them power. He showed himself alive to Thomas, who had not been present during his first post-resurrection appearance to the gathered apostles. He made his third post-resurrection appearance to the gathered disciples of the Sea of Tiberias, during which he brought about another miraculous catch of fish. He asked Peter about his love for him and foretold the manner of Peter's death. He appeared to his apostles on a mountain in Galilee after they finally went there in belated obedience to his command. He gave them the Great Commission to evangelize the world. They returned to Jerusalem and he gave them further instructions for their coming ministry, Acts 1:4-8. At the end of the 40 days, Jesus led his disciples out to Bethany, and then he ascended into heaven. And there you have it, the four accounts of the resurrection from the four gospel books, all fully reconciled, no contradictions, all based on things people reasonably would do, and fully in accord with both Acts 1 and 1 Corinthians 15:5-7 as well. And so I wonder about people who say it can't be done, whether they actually tried, because really you sit down with the Bible and about an hour of time, maybe two, you should be able to do it. And it's really not right to say it can't be done, especially if you've never tried. Let's return to Armin's specific claims of irreconcilable contradictions and unanswerable problems and see how, in fact, our reconciliation has answered them. He asked who actually went to the tomb, Mary alone, Mary and other Mary, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, or women who had accompanied Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, Apostle Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. Well, As we saw, all of these women went. The fact that each writer lists only some of them doesn't matter. Remember the World Junior Hockey Championship articles. The fact that two writers didn't mention Barbashev doesn't matter. It doesn't mean he wasn't there. Had the stone already been rolled away? Or was it rolled away by an angel while they were there? It had already been rolled away. Matthew 28:2, contra Armin's suggestions, does not say it was rolled away while they were there. It simply says an angel rolled it away. Whom or what did they see there? An angel, a young man, two men, or nothing and no one? First, let's take a quick look at Revelation 21:17. Then he measured its wall 140 cubits according to the measure of a man, that is, of an angel. This indicates that the Greek terms can be used interchangeably. So there was one angel when the women first entered the tomb, none when Mary Magdalene returned with Peter and John, and two when the women visited the tomb the second time. Fits perfectly. What were they told? To tell the disciples to go to Galilee where Jesus will meet them? Or to remember what Jesus had told them while he was in Galilee, that he had to die and rise again. Now, we could have said both at the same time. They did say both, but it's reasonable that that second statement was that one of them was made during one visit to the tomb and the other during the other visit to the tomb. Do the women tell the disciples what they saw and heard, or do they not tell anyone? After the first visit to the tomb, the women flee and tell no one. But after Mary Magdalene meets the risen Jesus and brings the women back to the tomb, they are given the second message by the angels and tell the disciples what they saw and heard. If they tell someone, whom do they tell? The 11 disciples? The 11 disciples and other people? Simon Peter and another unnamed disciple? Mary Magdalene tells Peter and John after the first visit to the tomb. After the second visit, the women tell the 11 disciples and others with them. Mentioning only the 11 disciples does not mean that others were not there. Again, remember the World Junior Hockey Championship articles. What do the disciples do in response? Do they have no response because Jesus immediately appears to them? Do they not believe the women because it seems to be an idle tale? Or do they go to the tomb to see for themselves? As we saw, the visit in John 25 by John and Peter is in response to the report that the body had been moved. It was later that the women brought the news of the resurrection, which the disciples did not believe. In Matthew 20, verse 9, Jesus appears to the women on their way to tell the disciples. He does not appear to the disciples. Jesus appears to them in the evening, not immediately. And then we said one point in particular seems to be irreconcilable. In Matthew's account, the women are instructed to tell the disciples to go to Galilee to meet Jesus, and they immediately do so. He appears to them there and gives them their final instruction. Here, the discrepancy is created by reading in something that is not in the text. Matthew does not say that they immediately went to Galilee. In fact, it was at some later point during the 40 days period. But in Luke, the disciples are not told to go to Galilee. They are told that Jesus had foretold his resurrection while he was in Galilee, and they never leave Jerusalem. On the day of resurrection, Jesus appears to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Later that day, these disciples tell the others what they have seen, and Jesus appears to all of them. And then Jesus takes them to Bethany on the outskirts of Jerusalem and gives them their instructions and ascends to heaven. The disciples are in fact told explicitly by Jesus after his resurrection not to leave Jerusalem. Okay? Now, this completely overlooks the fact of the 40 days period. They started in Jerusalem, they ended in Jerusalem, but they were not there for the whole time. Okay? And so the discrepancy, if Matthew is right that the disciples immediately go to Galilee and see Jesus ascend from there, how can Luke be right that the disciples stay in Jerusalem the whole time, see Jesus ascend from there, and stay on until the day of Pentecost? Matthew didn't say that the disciples went to Galilee immediately. They didn't. He doesn't say that Jesus ascended from Galilee. He didn't. Luke does not say that the disciples stayed in Jerusalem the whole time. They didn't. The reason he had to meet them in Jerusalem, as we've said, is because they didn't believe and so didn't go to Galilee. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to bring his disciples word. As we have seen, there were two separate visits to the tomb. Mark 16:8 is the reaction to the first, Matthew 28:8 to the second. No contradictions, no unanswerable problems. Armin, though, and what do liberal scholars and skeptics say about this approach? Well, they would say some of these differences can scarcely be reconciled unless you do a lot of interpretive gymnastics when reading the texts. For example, what does one do with the fact that women apparently meet different people at the tomb? This solution is saying, in effect, that what really happened is not narrated by any of these gospels, for none of them mentions two angels. This way of interpreting text does so by imagining a new text that is unlike any of the others, so as to reconcile the four to one another. In one gospel, the disciples admit to go to Galilee, and in the other, they never go there. As New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, himself a Roman Catholic priest, has emphasized, thus we must reject the thesis that the Gospels can be harmonized through a rearrangement whereby Jesus appears several times to the 12. First in Jerusalem, then in Galilee. The different gospel accounts are narrativing, so far as substance is concerned, the same basic appearance to the 12, whether they located in Jerusalem or in Galilee. This is Armin's other gambit. Let's take a moment to unpack this lunacy, folks. Okay. Doesn't take a rocket scientist here to see what happened. The angel did send the instruction for the disciples to go to Galilee, but they didn't believe it. They didn't go to Galilee because they didn't believe he'd risen, and they'd see him there, which is why he first appeared to them in Jerusalem and why he rebuked them. They went to Galilee afterwards. Now, this says, we must reject the thesis that the Gospels can be harmonized to a rearrangement whereby Jesus appears several times to 12, first in Jerusalem, then in Galilee. So, he says we have to reject the idea that Jesus appeared more than once to the 12. No. There was just one appearance to the 12. Now, that one didn't actually happen, according to Brown. He doesn't believe Jesus rose from the dead, but there's only one account, and you can't say there was more than one. Well, our writers tell us that he presented himself alive with many infallible proofs seen through them during 40 days. Was there really only one appearance to the 12? Were all the Gospels narrativing the same basic appearance? Okay. The same day of the evening, being the first day of the week, Jesus came and stood in the midst. After 8 days, Jesus came. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples. He was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, after that by over 500 brethren once, after that by James, then by all the apostles. Was there only one appearance to the 12? No, there were many. Is it too much to ask this Roman Catholic priest and scholar to actually read the Bible and pay attention to it before he comments on it? Or is it that he's looking for a way to maintain contradiction by saying something that's just absolutely absurd? We must reject the thesis. Folks, this is how liberal scholarship operates. We have a bald assertion, we must reject the thesis. Why? Why should we reject the idea that he appeared more than once when the text tells us he did? Why should we reject the thesis when common sense says he would appear more than once? Why should we reject the thesis when the appearances are described differently? Why? It's clearly not the case, but we're supposed to accept it anyway. Why? Well, because he's a scholar, you see. Scholars are always right. And he's not just a scholar, but he has emphasizes it, so you have to take it seriously. And he uses highfalutin words like narrativing, so he must be so smart. But in fact, there's no such word as narrativing. Yeah. This is how liberal scholarship operates, folks. We saw that in the first presentation. Bald assertions, assumptions, presuppositions, not facts. Empty statements hiding behind titles and academic credentials. This is how it operates, folks. Dude, I am totally buffing. Always. Claims like these that we've seen, filled with discrepancies which cannot be reconciled, disagree on nearly every detail. Claims like these are just plain false. The challenge of reconciliation has been fully met, and as a result, you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. Praise God.